Welcome to the 2012 Africa Dialogue Series here in the Platinum Province of South Africa, where we are talking about how to integrate Africa's 54 economies. This conference is being attended by senior government as well as business leaders, but particularly the trade ministers of Africa. What is at stake? What is at stake is a continent of 1 billion people, as well as a combined GDP of 1.6 trillion US dollars. And the key question is, how do we make sure that the continent functions as a unit, and then we make sure that the continent benefits from South Africa's membership of the BRIC nations, that is, of course, Brazil, Russia, India, as well as China. Now, Anusha Gounden, head Africa desk at Deloitte, kicked off the conversation by putting it in context, outlining what is at stake.
When BRIC became BRICS in 2010, it was widely regarded as the inclusion of the African continent and not just South Africa. Significant debate has also ensued as whether South Africa should really be part of BRICS or should it not. But that is really an academic debate, and reality is that it is BRICS. And the discussion should be focused on going forward and how inclusion will enhance growth on our continent, both economically and socially. The 5 BRICS member countries account for 18% of the world's GDP, 43% of its population, that's approximately 3 billion people, 15% of global trade, and 40% of global currency reserves. I think in anyone's estimations, that is definitely a block to be recognized, and it's key to Africa's growth. To start the discussion, I'm going to ask Honourable Minister Davies to share his impressions from the recent 2012 BRICS Summit in India.
Well, thanks very much. I think that South Africa's entry to the BRICS came at a fortuitous moment. As you indicated, we joined in 2010. But at that stage, the BRICS had not yet developed a fully fledged program of cooperation within the BRICS themselves. And so I think we came in at a time when we were able to influence and shape that particular aspect of the program. Because there are 2 aspects, I think, of the BRICS coordination that takes place. One is around coordination of positions on matters of global governance. And that includes things from the reform of the United Nations Security Council through to the reform of governance of the IMF, the World Bank, the World Trade Organization, and all of those kinds of issues. And there's been, in fact, a lot of cooperation on those fronts going back even as far as South Africa was concerned. Before we joined the BRICS, we were also in a lot of contact with other members of the BRICS around that. What happened at this particular summit was, I think we identified some very, very important steps forward on intra-BRICS cooperation, which I think have got significance not just for BRICS member countries themselves, but also for the rest of the African continent. Just to give a little bit of background, I think that the extent of trade relations, just to take South Africa as an example, the trade relations with other BRICS has been growing exponentially. For example, in 2011, South Africa's total trade with the other BRICS countries went up 29%. That was a very significant jump, and it contrasted with many members of the European Union where our trade may have grown a little bit in 2011. In some cases, it shrunk in the most distressed European countries, and in all cases, it's nowhere near the level that it reached in 2008. That's the picture that we've got. But what we, I think, are seeking is not just a quantitative increase, but also a qualitative change in the nature of the trade relations. We're looking to try to promote a more balanced pattern of trade, not just where African countries, and ourselves included, are suppliers of primary products, but also that we begin to industrialize and we have a trade that embraces value-added products. So I think the 2 important decisions that came out was that there was an agreement that we should establish what is now being called a BRICS-led development finance institution. And this, I think, we think of as very, very significant, not just for ourselves, but for the African continent, because BRICS countries are capital surplus countries. BRICS countries have been investing some of these in developed world financial securities and things of that sort, and I think they're now looking for new alternative sources of investment, and some of these, I think, can find outlets, in our view, in a lot of the infrastructure and other projects on the African continent. The other decision that was taken was that there was an agreement signed between development finance institutions of the BRICS member countries to establish credit lines denominated in own currencies so that we can avoid a situation in which we have to convert currencies into convertible currencies and in that way conduct our trade. I think in the first instance this is in fact a trade facilitation exercise. It reduces the costs of having to go and change rands into dollars, dollars into renminbi. That's what it does. It cuts that leg out. So I think that particularly the BRICS-led development bank is still work in progress. South Africa strongly supports this. I think that we know that many other African countries strongly support this. We would like to see that work proceed expeditiously and that institution come into being as quickly as possible. So I think those were the two major achievements in this particular summit. Thanks.
Thank you, Minister, for those opening remarks, and thank you for touching on some of the more contentious issues, because I certainly think the whole currency issue and whether we can use one currency within the economic blocks that we have around the world is another issue. But I want to bring Minister Pravin Gordhan into the conversation here. Minister, how do we make the conversation around South Africa's relevance in the BRICS relevant for the African continent? How do we make South Africa benefit while at the same time pulling the African continent along with it?
Well, in the first instance, South Africa is on the African continent, and BRICS leaders thought it necessary that the African continent, not just South Africa, be represented in this essentially developing country formation. Secondly, the relevance lies in finding Africa's location, if you like, within the geopolitical transition that is taking place currently, meaning that there's new and emerging powers, both economically and politically speaking, and in some ways this is reflected in what my colleague Minister Davies pointed out as one of the areas of discussion at the BRICS summit, and that is, for example, the reform of the United Nations Security Council. And amongst the candidates for new seats on the Security Council would be India, Brazil, and South Africa, for example. And that again is reflective of the fact that multilateral bodies like the United Nations can't be seen as representative of all balances of forces, but need to reflect new or emerging realities as we have them. The second is, if you like, the fact that we are going through an economic transition. And again, South Africa, in different contexts, works with other African countries to try to reflect the African voice. So, for example, in the G20 context, we have a formation on the continent called the C10. 5 finance ministers and 5 central bank governors from 10 different countries who meet at least twice a year to share understanding about where the G20 is going, what are the issues, and how could the African voice be heard within that context as well. Interestingly, South Africa, Angola, and Nigeria share what is called a constituency within the World Bank, one of 25 constituencies. So as we're sitting here today, in about an hour or two, the interview of the third candidate for the presidency of the World Bank will be taking place. The last two happened over the last 2 days. And today, Dr. Kim, the nominee of the United States, will be interviewed by the World Bank board. And at the moment, you have a South African who represents this constituency around the table and represents in the first instance the 3 countries, but more broadly speaking, the African continent together with the other 2 constituencies. And perhaps thirdly, South African comparative advantage in the financial sector plays a big role in terms of supporting trade and economic development and investment on the African continent. South African banks, South African insurance companies, and others are making their presence felt on the African continent and need to find deep roots across the continent in different countries. And in that way, South Africa continues to play a championing role, not only for its own companies, but for the continent as a whole. And the two areas which Minister Davies mentioned, the local currency credit facilities and there's another one called the multilateral letter of credit confirmation facility, are going to become important tools for those of you that want to do trade within the intra-BRICS context. And here again, South Africa, as a representative of the African continent, will continue to, as we move towards South Africa hosting the next summit in March next year, find new ways of establishing financial and logistical infrastructure that will enhance BRICS trade, intra-BRICS investment, and creating the right kind of institutions and connectivity that will assist both government and the business sector as well.
Thank you, Honourable Minister Gordon. Honourable Minister Pule, in the context about increasing cooperation within BRICS, what do you believe should be the key areas for cooperation, in particular in the area of communications?
Anusha, thank you very much. I think first of all, let me start by saying that what is important for us in South Africa and in Africa at large is access to ICTs and communications, but also is to try and bridge the digital divide. And therefore, we think that there's an opportunity for us being in BRICS, in that we can then share in our knowledge with our counterparts in BRICS. For an example, with India, what we can share with India is to understand how they have revolutionized their ICTs in the country. And at some point when I spoke to them, Anusha, and I asked a question around the rollout of broadband, and I said, how much did you invest? And they said something like $8 billion US. And I think that we are learning as a country, and I think that also as Africa, that for us to be able to prosper in communications, we have to invest a lot of money into ICTs. But two, I think that what we can share with our colleagues, I know that in India they are very good in animation broadcasting. It's something that we can learn and share with them. We have started or begun in Africa also many applications, and earlier on I spoke about M-Pesa, which I think that we have shared with India. And I think that there are other areas where we can share with China, we can share with the other members of BRICS. It only needs an opportunity where we can sit with them and discuss. But also I want to say that it cannot only be government who then begin to share with these countries. I think we must call upon the companies in South Africa and in Africa at large who are in the ICT sector to participate and find opportunities to go out there in the BRICS countries to go and participate. Because as I look at it now, what I see is that these BRICS countries are actually in Africa. They are doing business in Africa more than we are doing business in their countries. As I speak, I mean, if you were to look at China, Huawei, ZTE, and other countries, I mean, other companies are in Africa, including South Africa. And when you look in India, you see Airtel. It's almost in so many other countries in Africa. And I think that we can learn from that experience and go out there, and trade as South Africa and as Africa in ICTs. And lastly, I think also is that, on the rollout of the infrastructure, which is broadband network, it's quite important that companies, and I'm happy that Andrew is here, it's quite important that companies in South Africa and in Africa participate in helping us to roll out broadband so that it is themselves in Africa and in South Africa that are rolling out the best broadband. So we don't complain about somebody coming from another country to come and roll out broadband that may not necessarily address our needs.
Minister, I'm happy to inform you that sitting right on this table is a company that is invested in a BRIC country, so perhaps your call for private sector involvement in investing in other BRIC countries is certainly being heeded. But let's speak to an expert on the issue that you've just been speaking about, Andrew Mtembu. Andrew, when I look at the amounts of money that are being sunk into developing Africa's communications infrastructure, I see very, very thick lines drawn around both sides of the African continent, on both sides of Africa. They show cable paths that are coming down into Africa and bringing with them communications for the African people. What I'm not seeing, though, are similarly strong and bold lines connecting the other BRIC nations. So you're talking about Brazil, you're talking about India, you're talking about China. Of course, Russia is the other side of the world. How do we make the private sector, and in communications in particular, follow the political path that we are seeing being charted by our leaders?
Thank you very much for that question. You're right. If you look at the map of Africa today, if you look at the West, there's a number of cables that land in Africa. In fact, there's one cable that's going to be coming live in May, which lands in 12 countries on the west coast of Africa. And then if you look in the east, there's about 3 cables that all land on the east coast of Africa, being Easy, Teams, and Seacom. The interesting thing is that if you look at all of these, they all somehow tend to also touch South Africa, which makes South Africa strategically important, in the sense that whereas all of these cables enable communication between Africa and Europe or the Northern Hemisphere, South Africa now then becomes the strategic point whereby all of these African countries that are connected by these networks can then link into BRICS via South Africa. What is missing and what is a challenge is for South Africa now to have or to put forward a project which then links South Africa with all of the BRICS countries to facilitate all of the flow of information that we've been talking about for purposes of transactions, share of expertise, etc., etc. And it is for this purpose that my company, i3 Africa, has put forward, and very much supported by the South African government, a project which we've been working on for the last 12 months, which purports to do exactly that, and that is link the BRICS countries. And we're very advanced with this. As a matter of fact, we'll be doing a global launch on Friday on this project. And we're quite confident that this project is going to get off the ground. We've seen a lot of interest from the BRICS countries for participation in this project and putting forward money to make sure that it happens. And in conclusion, all I can say is that with this project, we then would see an opportunity where South Africa plays a strategic role in being the gateway into Africa for the BRICS countries and vice versa. That is to say, being a gateway into the BRICS countries for African countries by way of linkage with the other marine cables that land in South Africa. Thank you.
Andrew, thank you very much for showing us the improvements in connectivity that will improve the path from BRICS countries looking to invest into the continent. But if we turn that around from a two-way trade perspective, and we have a discussion, I think we'll look for Ian's view on that. Ian is a South African company that has invested in a BRICS country, being India in this instance. What led to your expansion in that market, and what are the key learnings that can be taken out of that for other South African companies?
Thank you, Anushka. I think as an African company going into BRICS nations, particularly India, as a company we had to seek out areas that we could compete. We couldn't compete on size when one thinks of the global, large global players. And so we sought environments where the skill sets that we have, the ability to deliver products into low-income groups as well as middle and high-income groups, was important. So India for us had similarities as a market where we could capitalize on skills rather than just size. But in the context of BRICS, it's much greater than that. I think as we sit on what has been called the beginning of the largest infrastructure spend in the history of mankind, every brick that is laid, every road that is built, every power station that goes up will be insured. And the way things stand at the moment in global insurance markets, it's a sad fact that much of that insurance will be done by Western markets. And it's done by Western markets by default. Minister Patel was speaking earlier today of putting a map of Africa across the transportation systems. If we do something similar across the route of the global insurance industry, we find that all roads actually lead to London. And whilst we enjoy doing business with our London partners, it's not acceptable to see the large, tremendous infrastructure taking place between BRICS nations. And because of historical rules, historical boundaries, the African and South African insurance industries, as well as the Indian and Brazilian insurance industries, cannot participate. These conditions are exacerbated by the actions of global rating agencies who seem absolutely oblivious to the pandemonium in their own countries and yet penalize our countries when we try to do business together. A sad fact that it's easier to do business from Botswana into London than it is Botswana into South Africa because of the mechanisms of the way global insurance paths are generated. So for us, being part of BRICS is also part of being part of the global economic shift, to put together new paths, to break down some of those colonial paths that have been laid, and to break down some mindsets. If we ask the audience to please raise your hand and tell us where is the center of the insurance industry, 98% will put their hands up and say London. We would like them to put their hands up in a short period of time and say it's in Johannesburg, it's in Delhi, it's in Shanghai, and elsewhere in Africa. So being part of BRICS is a tremendous opportunity for our company, for our country, and I think for the African insurance industry and other BRICS insurance industries.
Indeed, Ian, thank you for your witness and your testimony. Simon, I left you for last for a very good reason. As you can see, we've got business people here at the table. We've got political leaders here at the table. And I want you to try and make sense for us. The testimony that you have had, the evidence that you have had, is that what is being reflected by the numbers that we are seeing on the ground? What do you see when you look and you do the numbers and you look at trade between India and South Africa, India and Brazil, and Russia and South Africa for that matter?
Thanks, Godfrey. So in 2006, we started writing around BRIC Africa, and we launched a monthly report on this. And at the time, there was a fair amount of skepticism. You know, what is BRIC? It's an acronym, and it was a very successful one. But since between 2001 and 2011, we've seen BRIC Africa trade increase more than tenfold. So from around $20 billion in 2001 to over $200 billion last year. That growth in trade has been quite staggering. And South Africa, of course, as the largest economy on the market, largest economy on the continent, has certainly been at the forefront of those new trade linkages. So I see that our trade with Russia in the last few years has actually declined, and China is overwhelmingly our largest BRIC trade partner. I think around 75% of BRICS South Africa trade is South Africa's trade with China alone. India trade with South Africa we've seen growing quite strongly, and the figures really are testament to that. So as Minister Davies mentioned, last year we saw BRICS South Africa trade increase at around 29%. But if you look at the last 4 years, between 2007 and 2011, BRICS South Africa trade increased by 110% compared to 12% growth in South Africa's trade with the European Union. So that's a significant force in the reshaping of our trade relations, not just in South Africa, but across the borders in the rest of Africa as well. So trade is fundamental, and we've seen very strong advances in that regard. And trade has not only been a story of Africa exporting commodities to these energy-intensive, industrializing BRIC nations. We've also seen a tremendous surge in African imports of BRIC goods, particularly China and to an extent India. So the handsets that are in large part fueling the telecommunications revolution we're seeing in the rest of the continent are for the most part made in China. Handsets which are affordable, which you can link to the internet through and cost around $20 or $30. And I was in Kenya last week and I forgot my cell phone at home and I bought one of these and I was able to access my email over a $20 phone. So I think these types of developments are really powering that surge, and it's this demand from Africa's consumer boom for the types of goods that the BRICS, particularly China and India, are able to produce. In investment, again, we've seen a huge surge in BRIC investment in Africa. Again, China has fundamentally led that. Very much linked to infrastructure, very much linked to unlocking resource potential across African markets. But I think one factor which I will end on, and I think is very important for our discourse, is that South African firms punch well above their weight in terms of our overall economic size. So our corporates are traditionally
far more dominant internationally than the size of our economy may warrant. And as a result, we've seen very strong SA corporate footprint in some of these BRIC markets. So it's not just Standard Bank and Hollard, you're also looking at firms like Naspers and Sasol and SAB Miller, which are gaining increasing traction in these fast-growing BRIC markets. And it's one of the reasons I'm most optimistic around the BRICS grouping itself, is to try and enhance our economic diplomacy and ensure that our firms have more fluid access to the BRIC markets, rather than just allowing a gateway status for BRIC firms to come into Africa.
You're watching the Africa Dialogue series. When we come back, we'll be discussing some of the issues arising out of the discussion that we had in the first 28 minutes or so. And then we will also be discussing, amongst many other things, the chickens. Don't go away.